The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying with it the faint scent of damp grass and distant city sounds. Buckingham Palace stood tall and majestic against the soft glow of the rising sun, its golden gates gleaming under the light. Tourists from all corners of the world had gathered early to witness one of London's most iconic traditions, the changing of the guard. Cameras dangled around necks, children clutched their parents' hands, and excited chatter filled the air as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. Among the crowd stood an elderly man who seemed out of place yet deeply connected to the moment. His name was Harold Thompson, though no one in the bustling square knew him personally. Harold leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his steps slow but deliberate. Despite his frailty, there was something unmistakably dignified about him. He wore an old military uniform, faded slightly with time, but still bearing the marks of pride and valor. Rows of medals adorned his chest, each one telling a story of battles fought, lives lost, and victories earned during World War II. Harold's eyes scanned the scene before him, taking in the grandeur of the palace and the anticipation of the people around him. Memories flooded back like waves crashing against the shore. He remembered standing in formations just like the ones he saw now, young and full of energy, surrounded by men who would become his brothers in arms. Some of those faces were forever etched in his mind, while others had faded over the years. Still, every medal pinned to his jacket carried the weight of those memories, reminding him of sacrifices made and promises kept. As the clock struck 11, the sound of drums began to echo through the square. The rhythmic beat signaled the start of the ceremony, drawing everyone's attention toward the palace gates. Harold watched intently as the royal guards marched into view, their red tunics and bearskin hats making them look almost larger than life. Their movements were precise, synchronized to perfection, each step commanding respect and admiration. For many in the crowd, this was nothing more than a spectacle, a glimpse into British history and tradition. But for Harold, it meant much more. Years ago, Harold himself had been part of such parades. Back then, he wasn't watching from the sidelines. He was among the ranks, marching alongside fellow soldiers. Those days felt like another lifetime now, but the emotions they stirred within him remained vivid. He could almost hear the distant roar of artillery fire, feel the cold bite of winter winds on the battlefield, and see the faces of comrades who hadn't returned home. Yet, amidst the pain and loss, there was also pride, a deep-seated belief that what they did mattered, that their efforts helped shape the freedom so many enjoyed today. Despite the passage of time, Harold's heart still beat in rhythm with the drums. His fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his cane as he straightened his posture, instinctively falling into the discipline of years gone by. Around him, tourists snapped photos and pointed at the guards, completely unaware of the silent battle raging inside the old veteran's mind. To them, he was just another face in the crowd. But Harold wasn't there simply to observe. He had come to pay tribute, to honor not only the guards standing before him, but also the countless souls whose names might never appear in history books. As the ceremony unfolded, Harold found himself overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: nostalgia, gratitude, and even sorrow. Yet beneath it all, there was a spark of hope, a quiet reminder that the values he once fought for were still alive, carried forward by the generations that followed. Little did he know, however, that this seemingly ordinary day was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. As the rhythmic marching of the royal guards continued, Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. The sight of those young men moving with such precision and discipline stirred something deep within him, a mixture of pride and longing. These soldiers reminded him so much of his own days in uniform, when he too had stood tall, ready to defend his country at any cost. The memories came rushing back, the camaraderie, the sacrifices, the unspoken bond shared by those who served together. Harold's gaze lingered on one particular guard standing near the gates. This soldier seemed different somehow, not because of his appearance or stance, but because Harold could sense a quiet strength behind his eyes. It was as if this young man carried not just the weight of his ceremonial duties, but also an understanding of what it truly meant to serve. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, though neither moved nor spoke. Yet in that fleeting connection, Harold felt seen, not as an old man leaning on a cane, but as a fellow soldier who had once walked the same path. Overcome by emotion, Harold decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his trembling right hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. It wasn't perfect. His arm shook slightly from age and fatigue, but it was heartfelt. Every ounce of respect, gratitude, and remembrance flowed into that single gesture. To Harold, it was more than just a formality. It was a tribute to every soldier who had ever worn a uniform, including the young men marching before him now. The movement caught the attention of the guard Harold had been watching. Corporal James Whittaker froze mid-step, his polished boots clicking against the pavement as he paused momentarily. His training told him to remain stoic, to keep his focus fixed ahead without acknowledging distractions. But there was something about Harold's salute that struck a chord deep inside him. Perhaps it was the way the old man held himself with quiet dignity despite his frailty. Or maybe it was the medals glinting faintly on his chest, each one a testament to battles fought long before James was even born. Whatever it was, James couldn't ignore it. For a brief second, time seemed to stand still. The bustling crowd around them faded into the background, leaving only Harold and James in sharp focus. James hesitated, torn between following protocol and responding to the raw humanity of the moment. Then, almost instinctively, he made his decision. Lowering his rifle slightly, he stepped forward and returned Harold's salute with impeccable precision. The gesture was swift yet deliberate, filled with a level of respect that went beyond mere duty. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what they were witnessing. No one expected a royal guard to break rank, let alone acknowledge someone in the audience. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the unexpected exchange, while whispers spread like wildfire among the spectators. "Did you see that?" one woman asked her companion, clutching her phone tightly. "He actually saluted him." Another man nearby muttered, "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." Even the other guards noticed the deviation, though none dared to react outwardly. They continued their march, maintaining the rhythm of the ceremony, but subtle glances betrayed their curiosity. What had prompted Corporal Whittaker to step outside the rigid boundaries of tradition? And why did it feel so profoundly right? Harold, meanwhile, was taken aback by the young guard's response. Tears welled up in his eyes as he lowered his hand, overwhelmed by the unexpected show of respect. He hadn't anticipated being acknowledged. He'd simply wanted to pay homage to the spirit of service embodied by the Royal Guards. But James's salute meant more to him than words could express. It was as if the young man had reached across decades, bridging the gap between past and present, and said, "We remember. We honor your sacrifice." In that instant, the barriers of age, rank, and time dissolved. Two soldiers, separated by generations, connected through a shared understanding of duty, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. Though neither spoke a word, their silent exchange spoke volumes, resonating deeply not only with each other, but also with everyone fortunate enough to witness it. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a story that would touch hearts far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. The moment Corporal James Whittaker broke rank to return Harold's salute, a ripple of astonishment spread through the crowd. People shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were witnessing a breach of protocol or something far greater, a rare glimpse into human connection that transcended rules and traditions. Even the commanding officer overseeing the ceremony raised an eyebrow at James's unexpected action. Yet there was no reprimand, no sharp command ordering him back into formation. Instead, the officer paused briefly, his gaze softening as he took in the scene before him. James, still holding his salute, locked eyes with Harold once more. There was no arrogance or defiance in his stance, only sincerity and respect. His face remained composed, but his eyes betrayed a depth of emotion that words could never fully capture. For James, this wasn't about disobeying orders. It was about honoring the legacy of those who had paved the way for soldiers like him. He saw in Harold not just an old man, but a living symbol of courage and sacrifice. The kind of hero history books often overlooked, but whose contributions shaped the very foundation of peace and freedom. Sensing the weight of the moment, the commanding officer signaled subtly for James to step aside. It was a calculated decision, one that balanced discipline with compassion. A ceremonial guard stepping out of line was unprecedented, yet the officer recognized the profound significance of what was unfolding. With a curt nod, he allowed James to take a short break, knowing instinctively that this encounter needed space to breathe. As James approached Harold, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some spectators leaned forward eagerly, trying to catch every detail of the interaction, while others simply stood in stunned silence. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing each step James took toward the elderly veteran. The air buzzed with anticipation, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment where time seemed to pause, allowing humanity to shine through. When James finally reached Harold, he stopped a respectful distance away and spoke softly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. "Sir," he began, his tone laced with reverence, "may I ask which regiment you served in?" Harold blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. Then, with a trembling hand, he pointed to one of the medals pinned to his chest, a small, unassuming piece of metal that carried immense meaning. "That one," Harold replied, his voice raspy but clear. "I was with the Royal Engineers during the war." James's eyes widened slightly as he processed the information. The Royal Engineers. That was the same battalion his grandfather had served in during World War I. James had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's bravery, how he'd risked his life building bridges under enemy fire, how he'd returned home haunted by memories, but determined to rebuild. To think that this frail, unassuming man standing before him might have walked the same battlefields, faced the same dangers, it left James speechless. For Harold, the realization struck just as deeply. As James mentioned his grandfather's name, fragments of memory came flooding back. He remembered a young corporal with bright eyes and a quick smile, a man who always carried a harmonica to lift spirits during the darkest nights. Could it be the same person? The resemblance was uncanny, though decades had passed since Harold last saw him. Overwhelmed by the coincidence, Harold felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. What were the chances that, out of all the guards stationed at Buckingham Palace, he would meet someone connected to his past? James noticed the glimmer of recognition in Harold's expression and pressed gently for more details. "Did you know him, sir? My grandfather often spoke about the men he served with, but I never thought I'd meet one of them." Harold nodded slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, son. I knew him well. He was a good man, a true soldier. We fought side by side on more than one occasion." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Here they were, a war veteran and a modern-day guard, linked not only by shared values, but also by bloodlines and history. For James, it was as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place, giving him a deeper understanding of his own identity and purpose. And for Harold, it was validation that the bonds forged in war endured long after the battles ended, weaving their way into future generations. The crowd watched in awe, completely absorbed in the unfolding drama. Strangers whispered to one another, piecing together snippets of the conversation. Mothers held their children closer, pointing out the two figures standing amidst the chaos of cameras and applause. In that fleeting exchange, something universal resonated, a reminder that behind every uniform, medal, and active sea, with the weight of their shared history settling between them, Harold and James found themselves drawn into a deeper conversation. The bustling crowd around them seemed to fade into the background, their murmurs and camera clicks becoming nothing more than a distant hum. For both men, this was no longer just an ordinary day at Buckingham Palace. It had transformed into something far more personal, intimate even, as they sat together on a nearby bench. James gestured for Harold to take a seat, offering his arm to steady the elderly veteran as he lowered himself carefully. Harold smiled faintly, touched by the young guard's thoughtfulness. Once seated, James leaned forward slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Tell me about it, sir," he said earnestly. "What was it like? Serving back then? I can't imagine." Harold chuckled softly, the sound tinged with both nostalgia and sadness. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts before speaking. "It's hard to explain unless you've lived it," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. "We were young, barely more than boys, really. Scared, unsure of what lay ahead, but determined to do our part." His gaze drifted toward the palace gates, where the guards continued their ceremonial march. "We didn't think much about glory or medals back then. It was about survival and looking out for each other." As Harold spoke, he painted vivid pictures of life on the battlefield. Days filled with grueling labor, nights spent huddled under makeshift shelters, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire. He described the camaraderie among his fellow soldiers, how they became brothers bound not by blood, but by shared hardship. "You learn things in war that stay with you forever," Harold said quietly. "Things about courage, sacrifice, and loss." His voice cracked slightly as he mentioned the friends who hadn't made it home, their faces still haunting him in quiet moments. James listened intently, his expression a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Though he trained rigorously for his role as a royal guard, his own experiences paled in comparison to the stories Harold recounted. Yet there was something familiar in the older man's words, a thread of understanding that transcended time. "My grandfather used to talk about those days," James admitted. "He never went into detail, not the way you're doing now, but I could always tell it meant something deep to him, something he carried until the end." Harold nodded knowingly. "War changes you," he said simply. "It leaves scars, not just on your body, but on your soul. But it also teaches you what truly matters: loyalty, duty, and the people standing beside you." He glanced at James, seeing echoes of his younger self in the guard's earnest eyes. "I see that same spirit in you, son. That's why I saluted you today, to remind you of the legacy you're carrying forward." Moved by Harold's words, James decided to share a bit of his own story. He spoke of joining the military after years of hearing his grandfather's tales, inspired by the idea of service and sacrifice. "When I first put on this uniform," James confessed, "I wanted to make him proud. But over time, I realized it wasn't just about him anymore. It's about protecting something bigger than myself, something worth fighting for." Their exchange bridged generations, creating a connection that felt almost sacred. As they talked, passers-by couldn't help but notice the intensity of their interaction. Some stopped to listen, while others snapped photos discreetly, sensing the gravity of the moment. A mother knelt beside her young son, whispering, "See those two men? They're showing us what real respect looks like." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his toy soldier tightly. For Harold, this conversation was cathartic, a chance to revisit memories he kept locked away for decades. And for James, it was enlightening, grounding him in the knowledge that his role as a guard was part of a much larger tapestry woven by those who came before him. By the time they finished speaking, both men felt lighter, as if sharing their stories had somehow healed old wounds and strengthened new bonds. But the moment wasn't over yet. Little did they know, James was about to make a gesture that would leave an indelible mark, not only on Harold, but on everyone watching. As their conversation deepened, the connection between Harold and James grew stronger with each passing moment. The bench they shared became more than just a resting place. It transformed into a bridge spanning decades of history, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication. Harold's words carried the weight of battles fought long ago, while James's reflections echoed the enduring spirit of service that still burned brightly in the hearts of modern soldiers. James, deeply moved by Harold's stories, began to see his own role in a new light. He realized that the discipline and honor he upheld as a royal guard were not merely traditions handed down through generations. They were living tributes to men like Harold. "Sir," James said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I wish more people could hear what you've told me today. It's humbling." Harold smiled faintly, his weathered face softening. "Son, I didn't tell you these things so others would hear them. I told you because you needed to know. You're part of this legacy now, whether you realize it or not." The simplicity of Harold's statement struck James like a thunderclap. For years, he had worn his uniform with pride, but he'd never fully grasped the depth of responsibility that came with it. Now, sitting beside someone who had literally risked everything for his country, James felt the magnitude of his duty settle over him like a mantle. It wasn't just about standing tall during ceremonies or maintaining perfect formations. It was about embodying the values of those who had paved the way for him. Wanting to express his gratitude in some tangible way, James reached into the inner pocket of his tunic. His fingers closed around a small pin bearing the insignia of the Royal Guard, a symbol of honor and tradition passed down within the ranks. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if what he was about to do was appropriate. But then he looked at Harold again, the faded medals on his chest, the cane supporting his frail frame, the quiet dignity etched into every line of his face, and knew exactly what he had to do. "Sir," James said, holding out the pin, "this belongs to you." Harold's eyes widened in surprise. "No, lad, I couldn't possibly." He started to protest, shaking his head, but James cut him off gently yet firmly. "Yes, sir, you can. And you will. This isn't just mine. It's yours too. Everything we stand for starts with men like you. Without your sacrifices, none of us would be here today." Harold stared at the pin in James's hand, his throat tightening with emotion. Slowly, reluctantly, he extended his trembling fingers to accept it. As James carefully pinned it to Harold's lapel, the crowd watching nearby erupted into spontaneous applause. Strangers wiped tears from their eyes, whispering words of admiration to one another. One woman clutched her heart, murmuring, "This is what true respect looks like." A father knelt beside his young daughter, explaining softly, "That man is giving something very special to the older gentleman, a piece of himself." For Harold, the gesture meant far more than the physical token itself. It was validation, a recognition of the pain, loss, and triumphs he and his comrades had endured. It was proof that their efforts had not been forgotten, even after all these years. Tears welled up in his eyes as he managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you'll ever know." James nodded, swallowing hard to steady himself. "It's the least I can do, sir. You've given so much. For me, for my grandfather, for everyone here today. Let this be a reminder that your legacy lives on." In that moment, the bond between them solidified into something eternal. Two men, separated by age and experience, stood united by a shared sense of purpose. Around them, the crowd continued to cheer, their applause growing louder and more heartfelt. Cameras flashed, capturing the exchange for posterity. But the real magic lay in the unspoken understanding between Harold and James, that the past and present are forever intertwined, bound together by acts of courage, kindness, and mutual respect. As the ceremony resumed in the background, neither man noticed the guards resuming their march or the tourists returning to their sightseeing. All that mattered was the connection they had forged, a timeless reminder that no matter how much the world changes, the values of honor, sacrifice, and humanity remain constant. As the crowd's applause began to subside, Harold sat motionless on the bench, his fingers brushing lightly against the pin now affixed to his lapel. The small emblem of the Royal Guard gleamed faintly in the sunlight, its weight far greater than its size suggested. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of gratitude, respect, and continuity. For Harold, it felt like a lifeline connecting him to the present, reminding him that his sacrifices, and those of his fallen comrades, had not been in vain. James stood beside him, his posture still upright but noticeably softer now. The rigid formality that had defined him as a guard seemed to melt away, replaced by genuine warmth and humility. "Sir," he said gently, breaking the silence, "I hope you know how much we owe to men like you. Every time I put on this uniform, I'll think of your stories, of everything you've done." His words carried a sincerity that resonated deeply with Harold, who nodded slowly, struggling to find his voice. "You don't owe me anything, lad," Harold replied after a pause, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "What I did, what all of us did back then, it wasn't for recognition or thanks. We did it because it was the right thing to do. Because someone had to." He glanced at James, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But if giving you my story helps remind you why you wear that uniform, then maybe there's still some purpose left in these old bones." The simplicity of Harold's response struck a chord with everyone listening. Even passers-by, who hadn't heard their earlier conversation, could sense the profound significance of the moment. A young couple holding hands nearby exchanged glances, moved by the quiet dignity of the exchange. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering to no one in particular, "This is what true heroes look like." James took a step closer to Harold, crouching slightly so they were eye level. "You may not see it, sir, but you're still serving," he said earnestly. "By sharing your experiences, by letting people know what you went through, you're teaching us. You're keeping the memory alive. That's service too." Harold chuckled softly, though his smile was tinged with sadness. "If that's the case, then consider this in order. Never stop asking questions. Never stop learning from the past. And never forget the ones who didn't make it home." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. James straightened up, his expression solemn yet resolute. "I won't, sir. I promise you that." There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of doubt. In that moment, he understood that being the soldier wasn't just about wearing a uniform or following orders. It was about carrying forward the torch lit by those who came before. The crowd, which had grown larger as news of the heartfelt encounter spread, erupted into another round of applause. This time, however, it wasn't just polite clapping. It was thunderous, heartfelt, and sustained. Tourists waved their phones in the air, capturing every second, while others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by the raw humanity unfolding before them. One man shouted, "Thank you," his voice cracking with emotion. Others quickly joined in, chanting "Thank you," until the entire square echoed with gratitude. Harold shifted uncomfortably under the sudden attention, unused to being the center of admiration. But James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, leaning down to whisper, "Let them thank you, sir. They need this as much as you do." Harold sighed, nodding reluctantly. He raised a shaky hand in acknowledgement, offering a small wave to the cheering crowd. The gesture prompted even louder cheers, with some people breaking into spontaneous chants of "God Save the Queen." Though the ceremony at Buckingham Palace continued in the background, it had become almost incidental now. The real spectacle, the heart-stopping, tear-inducing moment, was happening right here, on a simple bench surrounded by strangers turned witnesses. As cameras clicked furiously and social media feeds buzzed with updates, the story of Harold and James began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of the palace gates. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard, Harold rose slowly to his feet. James immediately stepped forward to assist him, steadying him with a firm grip on his arm. "I should be going," Harold said quietly, his voice barely audible over the lingering applause. "But thank you, son, for everything." James shook his head, refusing to let go of Harold's arm until he was certain the veteran was stable. "No, sir. Thank you." Their eyes met one last time, sealing an unspoken pact, a bond forged in mutual respect and shared sacrifice. As Harold turned to leave, he paused briefly, looking back at James with a faint smile. In that fleeting glance, there was. As Harold began to walk away, his steps were slower than before, but there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. The weight of years seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet strength that radiated from within. His hand rested lightly on the cane, and though his movements remained cautious, there was a newfound purpose in the way he carried himself. It was as if the encounter with James had reignited something inside him, a spark of pride, belonging, and validation that had long been buried beneath the passage of time. James watched Harold go, his heart swelling with emotion. For a moment, he stood frozen, his eyes following the elderly veteran as he navigated through the crowd. Strangers instinctively parted to let Harold pass, their faces filled with admiration and gratitude. Some offered gentle nods, while others whispered words of thanks. A young boy even stepped forward shyly, extending a small British flag toward Harold. Startled but touched, Harold accepted it with a trembling smile, patting the child's head gently before moving on. The energy in the square was electric, charged with an overwhelming sense of unity and shared humanity. People who moments earlier had been strangers were now exchanging glances, smiles, and even hugs, united by the profound impact of what they had witnessed. One woman held her phone aloft, streaming the scene live to her social media followers. "This is real life," she said tearfully into the camera. "This is what respect looks like. This is why we should never forget our heroes." Her words resonated deeply with those around her, sparking conversations among the crowd. Parents knelt beside their children, explaining the significance of Harold's medals and the sacrifices made by soldiers like him. Friends embraced, reflecting on how the simple act of a salute and a heartfelt exchange could remind them of the values that truly mattered: honor, courage, and connection. Even seasoned tourists, accustomed to witnessing grand ceremonies at Buckingham Palace, admitted this was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. Meanwhile, news outlets stationed nearby quickly picked up on the unfolding story. Reporters rushed to interview witnesses, eager to capture first-hand accounts of the extraordinary interaction between Harold and James. "It was incredible," one man told a journalist, his voice shaking with emotion. "You don't see moments like that every day." It wasn't just about the salute. It was about the bond they shared, the history, the legacy. It brought tears to my eyes. Another woman added, "I came here for the changing of the guard, but I'm leaving with so much more. This is what makes Britain great, not the pageantry, but the people." Back near the gates, James resumed his position among the royal guards, his presence now carrying an added layer of meaning. Though his face remained stoic, his colleagues noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. When questioned later by his commanding officer about the incident, James simply replied, "Sir, I did what felt right. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat." To everyone's surprise, the officer nodded approvingly, offering no reprimand. In fact, several guards privately thanked James for reminding them why they served, to honor not just the crown, but also the countless individuals who had fought to protect its ideals. By evening, the story had spread far beyond the palace grounds. Social media platforms buzzed with photos and videos of Harold and James, accompanied by captions like "A salute that moved us all" and "Never forget our heroes." News anchors across the globe highlighted the encounter during their broadcasts, calling it a poignant reminder of the enduring power of human connection. Comment sections overflowed with messages of gratitude, admiration, and reflection. One post read, "In a world often divided, this moment showed us what can happen when we take the time to truly see each other." For Harold, however, the day ended quietly. As he boarded a bus back home, clutching the small British flag given to him by the boy, he allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. He thought about James, the young guard who had bridged generations with a single gesture, and smiled faintly. Despite the accolades and attention, Harold knew the true gift lay not in recognition, but in knowing that his sacrifices had meaning. They had inspired someone else to carry the torch, ensuring that the flame would burn brightly for years to come. Unbeknownst to both men, their paths crossing had created ripples that would extend far beyond London, touching hearts, sparking conversations, and leaving an indelible mark on anyone fortunate enough to hear their story. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over London, Harold finally reached his modest home on the outskirts of the city. The quiet neighborhood was a stark contrast to the bustling energy of Buckingham Palace, but it suited him perfectly. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, and leaned against it for a moment, allowing himself to fully absorb the events of the day. His thoughts drifted back to James, the young guard whose salute had reignited a sense of purpose in him, and he couldn't help but smile. On the small dining table near the window, Harold placed the British flag given to him by the boy earlier that day. It lay beside the pin James had so humbly bestowed upon him, a symbol of gratitude that now held pride of place among his medals. Each item told a story, one of battles fought decades ago, another of connections forged across generations, and yet another of innocent admiration from a child who saw only heroism in his weathered face. Together, they painted a picture of Harold's life, not just as a soldier, but as a man whose legacy continued to inspire even after all these years. That evening, as Harold settled into his favorite armchair, he turned on the television. To his astonishment, news channels were already buzzing with coverage of the day's events. Reporters recounted the story of the elderly veteran and the Royal Guard, playing clips of their interaction over and over again. Social media feeds overflowed with heartfelt comments, photos, and videos shared by witnesses eager to spread the message of respect and unity. One tweet, accompanied by a photo of Harold saluting James, read simply, "This is what true honor looks like." Harold felt a lump rise in his throat as he scrolled through the posts online. Messages poured in from strangers around the world, some thanking him for his service, others sharing stories of their own family members who had served. A teenager wrote, "Because of you, I want to join the military someday." An elderly woman commented, "You reminded me of my late husband. He would have been proud to see this." Each word carried weight. Each sentiment touched his heart deeply. For the first time in years, Harold didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, valued, and appreciated. Meanwhile, at the barracks, James sat alone in his quarters, reflecting on the day's events. Though his fellow guards teased him good-naturedly about becoming an internet sensation, James remained grounded. He knew the attention wasn't about him. It was about the bond he'd formed with Harold and the reminder of why they all wore their uniforms. That night, he penned a letter to Harold, expressing his gratitude once more. "Dear Sir," he began, "I hope this note finds you well. Today changed something in me, something profound. Thank you for trusting me with your stories, for reminding me of the weight we carry, and for showing me what true courage looks like. Please know that your legacy lives on in all of us." The next morning, Harold received the letter along with dozens of others from people inspired by his story. As he read each one, tears streamed down his cheeks, not out of sadness, but out of joy and fulfillment. He realized then that his journey wasn't over. It had merely taken a new form. By sharing his experiences, he had become a beacon of hope, inspiring others to remember the sacrifices of the past while striving to build a better future. In the weeks that followed, Harold's story gained even more traction. Schools invited him to speak to students about his wartime experiences, emphasizing the importance of peace and resilience. Veterans organizations honored him at ceremonies, celebrating not only his bravery, but also the enduring spirit of camaraderie that connected soldiers across generations. And James, he became a symbol of compassion within the Royal Guard, often speaking publicly about the importance of recognizing those who paved the way for modern-day service. Though Harold and James didn't meet again in person, their bond remained unbroken. They exchanged letters regularly, updating each other on their lives and continuing the dialogue that had started on that fateful day. Their friendship became a testament to the power of human connection, a reminder that no matter how much time separates us, shared values and mutual respect can bridge any gap. Years later, when asked about the encounter, both men spoke of it with reverence. For Harold, it was proof that his sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. For James, it was a lesson he carried throughout his career, that every uniform tells a story, and every story deserves to be heard. Together, they reminded the world of an eternal truth, that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can leave an indelible mark on humanity. And so, what began as a quiet morning at Buckingham Palace transformed into a global movement, a celebration of courage, gratitude, and the timeless bonds that unite us all.